Okay, I'm gonna pick up where AC left from the last session and start using the application that AC built to really move it to an end user experience in a SharePoint app and a Windows 8 app. And again, there's a lot of JavaScript, there's a lot of code in here. It's going to be mainly a developer session. I'm Ben Robb, six-time SharePoint MVP, and this is the fifth year in a row we've had 5 conferences, haven't we? Yeah, fifth year at this conference, so really pleased to be here. And hope you're all enjoying yourself at this conference. So really, what I'm going to focus on is the end user experience. I'm going to build a SharePoint app, this time using XAML rather than C# rather than JavaScript. And secondly, build a couple of of Windows 8 apps that are going to talk both to the Azure web service that AC built out and SharePoint Online, and do some interesting stuff with that. So the SharePoint app that I'm building, I'm going to be viewing the learning paths, I'm going to be enrolling on some learning paths, and then when I'm done, I'm going to generate some Word documents to a certificate to prove that I've done that, and stick that certificate back in my SharePoint site. Really not going to talk too much about how the SharePoint app's been built, and it's in no way as pretty as AC's one. So let's just have a look at this. Ooh, that's interesting. That's running. Let's just make sure I've actually got internet connection, which might help. Right. So as I said, not quite as pretty as AC's one. Am I having some real trouble here? Yeah, using the Wi-Fi, I might connect to. Sorry, where's the? Can't see it. Ah, there. Yeah, spotted it. Okay. Right, this should be better. Okay, so here I've got some learning paths that are coming from the web service, the RESTful service that AC produced, and I'm just rendering those out as blocks. And here I have a button that enables me to enroll. And what that's done in the background, in my document library here, a few seconds ago, I've been able to auto-generate a Word document with some information that's been captured from that. So I've got my title and the name of the course that I've just completed. And the way that I've been able to do this, if I come into here, let me just show you all of this. So what I've got is I've got a standard C# based SharePoint application, and in here I've got my default.aspects page, which is doing all the work that I need to do. The other key file that I've got here is my document generation code, and I'll get onto that when I show you how I'm doing that. Everything else, though, is pretty straightforward stuff. I'm using the token helper to make sure I've got the right context, the right security tokens, and that allows me to secure my connection back to my application host. So I've got, in the same way that we saw with the JavaScript earlier, I'm accessing the app web URL, the host URL, and so I'm able to start working with the SharePoint application. So apart from that, what I've got is a simple service reference off to the Azure web service that AC was working with earlier. And so because I've got that service reference, I'm then very easily able to just iterate through my learning paths and add that to my learning path collection, and then do some data binding back to the front end. And if we have a look at that front end, effectively all I'm doing is I've got a list view control, list view control, and I'm then just doing some data binding back to the title of the learning path that I've got. And then I've got an enroll button up here, and clicking on that allows me to do some stuff, primarily which enables me to generate a Word document, and then use, from that generated Word document, which returns as a memory stream, I'm then able to push that up into SharePoint just using standard CSOM. So I'm using the files.add new file and uploading that file and then executing the query. So looking at how I'm actually generating up the Word document itself, I've got this small file here which allows me to do this. And what you'll see is I'm going to walk through all 10,000 and or so lines of code. So how did I generate the document? Sorry. How did I generate the document code? Because I didn't write all this by hand. What I did was I used the OpenXML SDK utility. What that allows you to do is bind to open a Word document in a tool which then reverse engineers that Word document for you into C# code. Very useful tool, means that you can generate Word documents on the fly in code without having to install Word on the server or make any use of that. And if you see what I'm doing, I've got a title and subtitle piece of information coming in as properties, and then in my package properties, I'm setting title and subject as subtitle. And then in the Word document itself, those are content controls within my Word document. So I'm just using standard Word stuff to generate information. So doing this in C#, pretty straightforward. Not stuff that you haven't seen in other sessions. So that's the SharePoint application. Just a couple of things on authentication before I go off on that. You use OAuth tokens to secure that. If you're in a SharePoint application, you don't need to generate those yourself because the trust relationship exists. The claims-based auth will work. You're able to pass those credentials straightforwardly in. To write back to SharePoint, there's two ways. The one I showed you earlier in the code uses file.add. This is another way of doing it using save binary direct. What that will do is it'll work with larger document sizes. The previous method I showed you doesn't work with very large document sizes because you'll get you'll hit some buffers. So the rest of the session, I'm really going to talk about Windows 8 applications and how you can use a lot of similar concepts that AC took you through earlier within a Windows 8 app. How many people here have ever written a Windows 8 app? I know you have. You hadn't last time.
No,
You have now. Okay. So I'm going to spend a bit of time just walking through what a Windows 8 app looks like when you first create it. And what I'll do is I'll just start a new project so you get to see. When you start a new project and you want to create a Windows 8 app, you've basically got a number of choices. If you want to go down the Manage Code XAML route, you can, under Visual C#, Windows Store, you can see there are a number of pre-built examples for you to go with. The one I'm using predominantly is the split application, and that gives this sort of split view, which doesn't come out very well in the resolution, but if I can, hopefully, no, it still doesn't look very good. The other ones are the grid view, the traditional Windows 8 grid view, or you can just start with a blank application. So that's the Visual C# route. The other way of doing it is by using JavaScript, and again you get those same three: the blank app, grid app, split app. But you also get a couple of other ones. You get the fixed layout app and the navigation app. The ones that I've used have all been using the split app because I want the ability to have information on both sides of my screen, and it was a good starting point to move forward on. So actually, if I just create a completely empty one. So when you first create this, sorry, I've just done a C# one. Let me just create a JavaScript one as well, and I'll flip between them so you can see how similar they are and also where there are differences. So in the C# one, in the XAML one, In the XAML one, you have some assets, a data model, and then some common files that help you with some common features that mean that you don't have to do a lot of this stuff by hand. So all of this is really driving to this split page, which basically has a title, some items, and then a view of those items as you click through. And just as we saw in AC's session, we're using data binding extensively, so we're separating the concerns of the user interface from the data model. And the data model is pretty straightforward. In this view, what we have is some groups that we're adding to our sample data group, and then beneath that we're adding some items to those groups. And we're doing pretty much exactly the same thing in our in the first one I'm going to show you here. In JavaScript, you get a very similar approach. So in the JavaScript model, we have pages. We have the items page and the split page, just as we had in the XAML view. And each page has an HTML page associated with it, a JavaScript and a CSS. But most of the real work is being done up in the core data library. And what that does is, just as you saw in the previous one, we're adding a number of groups, and then we're adding a number of sub-items to that. So if we actually have a look at this application here, let me just run it, and I'll show you some of the key features that we've built in. So I'm just going to log into my site so that I can get some information from there. But essentially what we've got is we've got, again, our entity framework code first, which is the first published item that's coming back from the learning paths collection. And then we've got a number of sub-items in here with some actions that we can do on that. And at the moment, I've got start and launch content. If I launch content, what I'll do is, no, my resolution's not wide enough for that. If I launch content, what that does is it spawns the native IE in the Windows app, in the Windows RT world, with a direct link to the to that document. And as I move down through these items, I've got my data binding with the URL and the title, and not a lot else in here. If I then start that, what that does is that goes and updates the data model that that AC session covered. So we've got learning paths, learning path items, but we've also got enrollments as an additional piece of information. And what the enrollments piece is basically keeping a record of these are the courses that I'm currently working on, and that's based on who I'm logged into this application as. So let me just come and show you some of this, how some of this actually worked in reality. So what we have is a single project here, and I've got my core CSS, my core images. That's what is used to define what the, 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 what the that's what's used to define what the logos are when you're in the Metro view, in the store, what gets shown. We also have our AppX manifest, and that's where we can define a whole bunch of other stuff about what information you want to present in the App Store. The other thing that you have to do, very similar to the SharePoint App Store, is decide what capabilities you want to enable. And again, that's something that the person installing the app gets told as they install it. So let's have a look at some of these pages and actually see how we're bringing this up. So that first page that we saw with the split view, with the items down the left-hand side and some stuff on the right-hand side, all the HTML to do that is just contained here. And what we have to do is we have a item list section class with some data binding, and we're data binding this div as a win.js UI list view, and then we're binding that with a couple of options, with saying how we want that to behave. So we only want to be able to select a single item. We don't want any swipe behavior, and tap behavior is the selection toggle. So all of how that's actually filled with data is done in the JavaScript file. So what we do is we get that list view that we just saw in the HTML, and then we bind the we get from our data library the items from the group, and we then bind that in. And the data library is up here in our core.js. And here what we're doing is very similar to what we were doing in the previous session. We're basically defining we're defining a namespace here so we can use it in other applications. And then effectively we're just generating that data by going and calling our service app, our Azure RESTful APIs. So we've got our OData source here. And we're, again, chaining our promises up. So one of the things that AC didn't mention around promises is you can chain them up. So what this is saying, this is one of the core data, the core ways of getting data into Windows 8 apps. We've got the win.js namespace. We've got a wrapped XML HTTP receiver, and the only thing that's different from the standard one that you get out of the box is that that's been made into something that can be used as a promise. So what then happens is it's saying call this RESTful URL, get the learning paths, and then do something when you get that data back. And if you don't do that, you had a choice of whether you use promises in the app that AC used. You don't have a choice in Windows 8. You can't. There's no other way of getting data in. It won't let you write code that will block that thread because the JavaScript is running in the same thread as the UI, and if you block that thread, your whole app will freeze. And so Microsoft just don't let you do that. So you have to get to grips with promises, and sometimes you get some quite funky results as you start trying to work with promises, particularly when you want to do what I needed to do here, which is go and get the learning paths, and then for each of the learning paths, go and get the items from that. So I actually had to do a number of RESTful OData calls in order to build up my data model. And if you don't do stuff in the right order, if you don't really understand how the promising stuff works, you run the risk of stuff happening out of order. So you get some side effects, you get some unintended consequences to doing that. And so what I'm doing here is I'm getting the learning paths, and then once I'm sure that I'm done with that, I'm then getting the learning items. And the learning items, right, so here I'm just iterating through the resulting learning paths that have come back and adding it to my group variable, and pushing each one into that group. And then for the learning items, it's pretty much the same. I'm loading some stuff from OData and using the URL, some information that I received about the learning group. So the learning path, the way that you tie that to your learning items is it's an OData URL, so a RESTful URL. So you end up with needing to manipulate that URL to put the ID of the learning path in to get that. So once we've got that, that will just automatically flow into my into my overall model, and then is available for pages like the split.js page to go and get that get the items from that. So one of the advantages of doing this using the split, the separation of concerns of UI over over data layer, is I was able to build out the interface for this without having any internet connectivity, which was handy. Would have been handy yesterday. And then once I was ready, and once AC had finished writing the RESTful service, I was then able to just go in and change just my data layer, and everything just flowed through into there. So the other thing that we saw, just to complete this part of the demo, the other thing we saw was when I opened the app for the first time, I had the ability to log into my site, and this is a bit more complex to do than in a SharePoint host in a SharePoint app. For a start, you don't have any context that you can call to, because you're not hosting anything. So you need to fall back to the tried and tested models from people like Victor Villen in order to go and get those tokens, the fedauth cookies, the RTFA cookie, in order to be able to secure the connection back to SharePoint. And that's made even more complicated in a Windows 8 app, because almost all of the traditional APIs that you would use as part of that process are not available to you in a Windows 8 app. So if I just go back to my C# version, my XAML version, and show you my references, you'll see that I don't have the standard references that you'd get in a ASP.NET web page or a standard old-fashioned Windows application. In a Win8 app, you've got .NET for Windows Store apps, which is not full-flavored .NET, and you've got some Windows stuff. If you try and add other stuff, it won't let you. You get a few things, But if I go to my assemblies, all the framework assemblies are already referenced, right? If I were to do that in a standard application like this one, you can see there's a huge number more of those. So just like in SharePoint applications, where you might want to consider the pattern of moving the bulk of your business logic off to some other service that's running in a web service layer somewhere. Again, you might want to consider doing the similar pattern for Windows 8 apps if you're developing those. And there's a couple of good reasons for that. And in fact, they're the same reasons why you might want to do that for a SharePoint app. Primarily, when you're developing and you're updating your your Windows 8 app, you really want to minimize the number of times that people have to go to the Windows Store and update your application. So if you can package the bulk of your business logic somewhere else that's in a single place, it can be upgraded centrally, that's going to be much easier to manage going forward, because most people will see on the store, the store tile, they'll see, they've got half a dozen applications that are waiting like this, but how many people actually go and click on that and actually update your app? So it's more challenging to put all that logic, embed it into your application. It's much better to start putting some of that logic out elsewhere. So let me just finish this. So some challenges there, and some big challenges in terms of using those cookies once you've actually received them. So it's not as straightforward as just making a call to an unsecure web server. The main problem is you can't add cookies to your XHR object, and that means that you can't affect the security credentials that get passed over. Now, if you're in a locally hosted SharePoint environment and you're connecting through Windows Auth, your own credentials can be passed straight through to SharePoint, and that authentication story works really well. In a Office 365 environment, you're very unlikely, unless you've done full synchronization of your Active Directory up to the Azure service, you're very unlikely to have that single sign-on experience. So you need to think about how you're going to authenticate. And then once you've got that, you then have to do some really nasty stuff, and I'll blog this and put some examples up online. But you basically have to effectively use sockets to build up your requests. You can't just use the standard approaches. And so what you'll see is, if I can. So in the login code behind, as it were, the JavaScript, you have to build that SAML request up, and then in this case you can use the standard XHR method to post to the STS SRF, and then you have to manipulate the stuff that comes back and get those cookies out of that. So it's a lot of string manipulation, a lot of difficulty about using that. What you can then do is store those variables after you've got them in session state. So those are then persisted across pages. And so you don't have to, every time you want to communicate with SharePoint, you don't have to reinforce the authentication. So then actually using that in our app to talk back to SharePoint, I'll show you a couple of examples of that. In this application, if I go to this page here, in this application, sorry, in data even. So here in this data model, what I'm doing is I'm binding to my SharePoint site, and I'm looking at the social feed from my SharePoint site, and I'm creating my my request here manually. There's no other way of really doing it. So you're basically building up your request and then passing that through the basic layers. And then what I'm able to do then is set my cookies, which are my fedauth tokens and my RTFA token. Once I've got that, SharePoint knows who I am and can authenticate the request. I'm like any other client at that point. So then after I've done that, I'm using my HTTP request object that I set up in my networking class. And so this is the HTTP request, and I'm using windows.networking.sockets.streamsocket. So I'm manually having to build all that stuff up because it's a secure connection. So once I've got that, I'm then able to bind to. In this case, I'm just binding to a list view again. So if I just run this, in fact, that is actually running. That one? No. This one. So this is my my social feed, and I'm able to get my to get even the images down from the SharePoint site that map to my my site. So if I look here, these images, the stars are the same ones that are being shown in my app. So this is just coming down from my news feed. And if we actually have a look at the OData that I'm querying here, you'll see. Sorry. If I just go and just have a look at this feed, you'll see that access denied. Interesting. Okay, SharePoint Online doesn't seem to be working. It's a feature. Awesome. I tried to access SharePoint.com. Okay, so I could show you the. I should have been able to show you the feed, but I can't. So then, if I then look at my the rest of what's going on in this demo page, where I had those two buttons, we see these two buttons here, the Start Enrollment and the Launch Content. Just quickly to show you how those were built out, I'll start with the show IE. That's very straightforward. I'm just using windows.system.launcher and launching that URI asynchronously. So I'm getting the value from my button and using that as my URL to push through. So very straightforward to launch native apps from within an existing app. So if you want to read PowerShell, PDF files or open web pages, very straightforward. Posting to the feed, posting to the feed. So what I'm doing here is I'm using the my/feed/post, and I'm posting a message to my newsfeed here. And what I'm doing is I've got my cookies that we saw earlier with, let me just take that out. So I've got my cookies. I'm then using JSON.stringify, just as we saw in AC session, and then I'm building up my my payload. And here I'm just setting the content text to message post, and I'm using sp.social.social post creation data as my type. And then I'm building up my post in the same way that we just saw with the get. And then I'm, again, calling my HTTP request. And then showing a flyout to show that that's done. So as I said, promises are really important. As AC said earlier, promises are really important in JavaScript development. In Windows 8 development, you have to use them. You can't access data in any other way. You can also use promises and chain them together, and it's important to understand the firing order. So what will happen is, in the code execution, when you have a promise.then with a function that gets called when the then fires, what will happen is your promise code will run. Then the very next line of code after that all the curly braces are closed, that will run. So it won't wait until the then function is called, and it will only call that at some point in the future. And you have no control when that gets called. It'll call it in the case of using the XHR. It'll call the then function as soon as it gets a response back. We have no idea when that's going to be. So you have to be very thoughtful about when you're building up your JavaScript files. You need to be very thoughtful about what's actually going on, what's the execution order. Does it matter if this other bit of code gets run while we're still waiting for that response to come back? Are we expecting to be able to manipulate the data from that comes back in that promise? If so, what you need to do is make sure that that's encapsulated in the function that you're calling in the then statement. The other thing about promises, and I haven't got many examples of it, and I didn't see many in AC's code either, it's really important to call .done as your final your final thing in the promise chain. You're not done. Fair enough, you're not done. The reason is if you're writing this for professional a proper project, you've got to think about error handling. And if you don't call .done, you're not guaranteed that you're going to be able to cater for the errors that come back. And that's why you should make sure that .done, because that's always called regardless. It's a bit like finally in C#. So I've done those demos. I was using the social feed API, so like all the other major features in SharePoint, there's an OData feed and there's a typo in that. There's underscore API. And authentication, it's really important. Victor Villan has a very good post on how to connect to Office 365 from other applications that are not SharePoint applications. He wrote it in the 2010 time frame, but actually it's all still relevant and all still useful. However, you can't just natively use it, the examples and code that he's got in your JavaScript applications, in your Windows 8 applications. You need to take the principles of that and then build up your application basically by hand. One of the things I'm looking to do is post some examples on so it's extending Victor's post and making some downloadable assets available for doing this. But I also know that the Microsoft team are releasing helper files as well. So I'm going to wait till they're done on that before I spend some cycles on that. So they're not out yet, but they are coming. Session variables, very useful, but you also have to think about when you're in a Windows 8 application, you have to think about not just storing that across a single session, you also have to think about what happens when that application is suspended. And the code to do that is, I'll show you the C# version. It's easier to find. He says. No, I'll show you in here. So I actually had it open. So in default.js, what you'll see is there's some code in here. Oh, interesting. Cool. So in default.js, which is in the base JS library, what you'll see is there's some code in here to do different things depending on where you are in that life cycle. So you can do some initialization stuff when the application is launched. You can also do stuff when it's been reactivated from suspension. So one of the things that the session state won't persist across sessions is so if I come back to the application that I've got running here, not that one, this one, you'll see that was suspended, and I've come back and it's just run my standard navigation code that says load this page as the first page. If you want to avoid that, what you do is in this code here, you would check the values of those variables, potentially check to see if those tokens are still valid, and if not, make the user log in. Otherwise, just send them back to the application. The navigation itself is pretty straightforward. I didn't really cover that, but we have a content host control, which is a page control navigator, and it defaults to the login page at the moment. And then in my navigator.js file, that's what sets up my overall control. That's my page, and then allows me to deals with all the code to navigate between different pages. So all of that is set up when you create an application. So if I come into my base application, my completely clean one, you'll see I have my default.js with all that same code and my navigator.js. And to be honest, I wouldn't change these too much. They work pretty well. They cover the basic navigation constructs that you're going to need in a Windows 8 app. Okay. So that's pretty much it. I guess my conclusions are that SharePoint apps, great way to work with line of business systems, make use of the RESTful APIs, make use of CSOM, and use that to build really rich interfaces, like his rather than mine, I think. And Windows 8 apps give you an additional user interface that you can start using. So if you're working with customers or your own company has rolled out Windows 8 to the desktop, you can now start building applications that can merge and provide productivity tools up to SharePoint using the RESTful APIs. You need to think about authentication though, because it is a challenge. Hopefully there'll be some guidance coming out in the near future. But I think that's me. So thank you very much for your time. Are there any questions?